All right, so we just talked about the different types of animations that we can do: constant velocity, fading in and fading out, ease in animations, aka ramped animations. So let's take a look at some JS and see how we can perform some of those animations with JS. All right, so this source code, of course, is located in the supplements folder. So let's take a look at what we have here. So let's first take a look at what we're going to do, and then we'll take a look at the code. So I'm going to fire it up here eventually. All right. So uh, here we have a basic page, HTML page, a little header, blah, blah, blah. All right, so let's take a look at constant velocity. So remember we said that constant velocity was the simplest kind that we could do, and it was basically just moving the object by a fixed amount. All right, so here we have a little text box that allows us to enter the velocity, and then when we click start animation, of course the animation is going to start. So let's take a look at it. Ooh. All right, if we click stop, the animation will stop in place. We increase the velocity, it's going to move much faster. All right, so we'll take a look at how we perform that animation. Here's an example of fading in and fading out. So enter the time in which to fade in seconds. So we'll start 1, then click fade out. So notice it goes from being there to not being there. All right, we want to speed it up. We'll go with 10. Let's fade it in. All right, so that slows it down, and it's not completely there. So fade in is disabled until fade out until it's completely available. That's going to go really slow. Notice that this button is disabled until the animation is done. All right. Um, Here's an example of ramped in or eased animation. So enter allows us to enter the duration of the animation in seconds. So we'll go with 1 second, and then choose the desired easing function. So we're using a quadratic function here to ease in, a quadratic function to ease out, and a quadratic function to ease in and out. So we go start animation. Boom, it just moves to the right. All right, if we go ease out, and it's going to ease back that left way. All right. All right, so let's take a look at the code for it. All right, so of course, I'm gonna let's bring it up over here to the right as we look at the code at the same time. So we see that we have a basic HTML document, of course. All right, so there's our title, basic animation, links to our style sheet. So we have a style sheet in here controlling the look of it. And here's a link to our JavaScript, which is stored in the JS folder. And the name of the script is basicanimation.js. All right, there's our body. Here's our header. Here's that first paragraph tag. Now we have a couple divs. So we have a div to store our CV, a div to store our fade part of the code, and a div to store our ease in out animation. All right, and then a container for a box. All right. Now let's look at the each one in closer detail. So for CV, constant velocity, of course, we have a header. Then we have a div containing our instructions that allows them to enter a velocity. Of course, we have an input box for velocity with the ID of CV-velocity. And we have a button that they can click to start the animation with the ID CV-button. All right, and we have a div container within the CV div for the box that will be animating. Okay, so just to look at it again, let's pull it back up. All right, so there's basically this is all one div. All right, and then there's a div to hold this box here for our animation. All right, here's our div for our fade. So it has a header, fading in and out. Our div for our instructions, an input box for the user's entry for the fade time, and then of course our button, fade button. All right, the initial value is set to fade out. All right, and of course, since that changes to fade in, you know that we're going to manipulate the text of this input box with our JavaScript and a container for the box that's being animated, and it's going to be called fade box. Here it was CV-box. Notice they both have the same class. All right, both boxes have the same class. All right, so there's our RV. All right, a header for our RV, or for ramped. There's our div for our instructions. In this case, we have a set of our input boxes, which are check boxes. The first one is checked. All right. And there's our button to start the animation, and there's our div with the container for the box. All right, so let's take a look at the CSS first. All right, so for our container, we're making the position relative. We're setting the margin top to 20, margin bottom to 100 pixels. And for anything with the class box, we're setting the position absolute, left top to 0, width is 50 pixels, height 50 pixels. Border is solid and black, and it's going to be 1 pixel, and the background color is gray. So there's our box. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at the CSS, the JS that does this animation. All right, so we'll take it each in turn. All right, so we know that if we break this down, we know that when the user clicks this start animation on the constant velocity, we want something to occur. We want our animation to occur. So that should signify to us that we need an event associated with the button. All right, so what do we do when we want to do something like that? When the page loads, we want to wire up our events. All right, so here you see us on the onLoad function, assign an anonymous function that grabs the CV button, and we're setting this onClick event to the function start constant velocity animation. Well, that makes sense. This is the constant velocity button, so we want to start the constant velocity animation. Notice again, it's an event, so we don't have this because it's not executing the function until the event occurs. So we omit that. All right, so for the fade button, we're setting the onClick to start fade out animation. Why start fade out? Because we defaulted it to fade out and not fade in. But that probably means that we'll have a fade in function as well. All right, here's our ramp button. The onClick event is assigned to the start eased animation. And ease in, all right, so get element by ID, ease in onClick. All right, so that corresponds to if they choose the radio button for ease in. Notice that's the ID for that. So if that's checked, then it's going to change the function or assign the function easing function. So we're going to have an easing function that's assigned the quad ease in function. All right. If they click ease out, we're going to assign the easing function to be the quad ease out. If they click the ease in out checkbox, then we're going to assign quad ease in and out to that easing function. All right. So we're remembering a function that, or we're setting a function that we want to execute based on what they click there. All right. All right, so let's take a look at the start constant velocity animation. All right, so here we have a function, and we're assigning it to a variable. That's for exporting global namespaces, all that kind of stuff. We talked about that back in Java 1. We may talk about it a little bit more, but we'll see. But basically, it's the equivalent of if I just said function start constant velocity animation. All right, but this means that just this name is exported. Okay. All right, so what do we want to do? We want to grab the velocity. So how do we grab the velocity? Well, we know that it's an input box. So we need to know what velocity they want. So we're going to grab the value from this input box. All right. Notice we defaulted it to 10. But if they changed it, we're going to grab it by grabbing the element and grabbing its value. All right. And we're going to parse it to a float. And we're going to assign it to a variable called velocity. All right. We're going to grab a reference to our box. In this case, specifically the CV box, because it's the element that we want to animate. All right, and we're going to set the style for the left to, if it has one, we're going to use it. If it doesn't, we're going to set it to 0 pixels. All right, now let's start animating it. So we look at the set interval function. So remember I talked about the set interval function. All right, so set interval takes a function that we want to execute, takes two values. It takes the function we want to execute when the interval expires. So here we're giving it a anonymous function. So let's take a look at this anonymous function. All right. So when the interval elapsed, this function is going to get executed. So what does it do? It creates a new left by taking the existing location of the style, which is going to be 0 in the beginning, right? and we're going to add the velocity to it. So 10 would be the velocity. All right. So if, and we're going to parse that to an integer. All right. So we're going to take the current left location in pixels, which will be 0 when we start off, which we did here. All right. And we're going to add the velocity to it. All right. And we're going to parse it to an integer, and we're going to store it in a variable called new left. All right. If the new left is less than 0, or the new left is greater than the max left, we're going to set the velocity, or we're going to decrement the velocity. So if we're going right, if we're going back to the left, then we're going to decrement the velocity. If we're going to the right, we're going to increase the velocity by the new left in pixels. All right. So that's how we're handling moving it across the screen. And here, milliseconds per frame is the second argument to set interval. That's the interval that we want in milliseconds. So here you're saying 30 milliseconds per frame. That usually gives 30 milliseconds per frame, pretty much gives that illusion to the user of movement. Okay? All right. Once we set that interval, we just assign it back to a variable. All right? Now, here's our code to toggle the start button for the stop animation, because remember that it toggled between start and stop. So we have a function called setup button. What does setup button do? Setup button takes a button, a label, and an on-click handler. All right. What does it do? It sets the button value to the label. It sets the on-click to the handler that you want, and it can and it sets the disabled value to false. So it enables that button. All right. So what are we doing here? We're calling that function. And we're grabbing the CV button reference, so we're passing the CV button to that. So that's the button that we're going to be setting those values on. We're setting the text to stop animation because it was start animation, so we're setting it to stop animation. All right. And the function that we want to assign to it, to the event handler, is to clear the interval. All right. Clear interval just resets, and we pass the interval ID, it just resets the interval, starts it over again. All right. Or stops the interval, sets it to 0, so it stops running. Okay, and then it's going to toggle the button because all this is still in the same function. All right, then it's going to change the button back to start animation, right, and start the animation again. All right, or set the handler back to start the animation when it's clicked. All right, so that's basically it for the constant velocity animation. All right, so for the fade in, fade out, we're going to grab the fade time, the value, all right, stored in a variable, nothing new there. We grab a reference to our box, and we set our opacity to if it has an existing one, or if it doesn't, we default it to 1. That's what this code does. If this is null or a falsy value, then we're going to use this value. So it's kind of like the tertiary, ternary, whatever you call it in Java or C#, okay? All right, so we create our fade rate, right? Then we get a reference to the fade button, and we set disabled to true. So we disable the fade buttons because remember the fade button was disabled until the fade was done. All right, so here again we're using set interval. So what function are we passing it? Well, the function that we're passing it, the anonymous function, all right, is going to solve this part right here. What does it do? It gets the existing opacity, parses it to a float, and then subtracts the fade rate to give us the new opacity. All right. If it's less than 0, then we're going to just set it to 0 because we're done. Stop the animation, clear the interval to stop the animation, and then we're going to change our button to fade in and set it to start animation. Notice we're using that same helper setup button. All right. If it's not less than 0, we're going to continue decreasing the opacity by setting it to the new opacity that we calculated. And then, of course, it's 30 milliseconds per frame for our interval. All right, pretty simple. Fade in is going to do just the opposite. So that's going to be fade in. I'm not going to go over that. All right, and because I think what I want you to do is study this code, but you get the general gist of how we use these functions to perform our animations. But I want you to study it because I think I may have you do a little discussion on how each of these work. All right, so play around with it and let me know if you have any questions. Take care.